The men who bought and sold human beings had a word for the Igbo, and the word was a warning. They called them difficult, prone to despair, the kind of captive who would rather die than be owned. Planters wrote it down as a defect, a weakness in the stock. For 2 centuries that label stuck, and the people it described faded into a footnote about a coastline few Americans could place on a map. Then geneticists started reading the DNA of Black America, and the footnote turned out to be one of the largest chapters in the whole book. Let's anchor this before we go anywhere, because the claim is big and it deserves a real foundation. In July 2020, the American Journal of Human Genetics published the landmark study by Stephen Micheletti, Joanna Mountain, and their team at 23andMe. More than 50,000 people's DNA on both sides of the Atlantic laid against the records of the slave trade. When they sorted the African ancestry of African Americans into regions, one region came out on top, and it surprised even them. Not the West African coast of the popular imagination, Nigeria. The researchers specifically named the ethno-linguistic groups the signal pointed to: Yoruba, Esan, and Igbo. Across the combined data, Nigerian ancestry consistently emerged as the single largest African component in the African American genome, by many analyses averaging around a third of all African ancestry. The largest single root, hiding in plain sight, but the story got sharper because other scientists pushed back in print. Later that same year, in the same journal, a team led by the biological anthropologist Fatima Jackson published a formal response titled, Plainly, So Many Nigerians. Their argument was that the 23andMe team had underexplained their own finding. The overrepresentation of Nigerian ancestry, they wrote, wasn't only about ships crossing the ocean. It was about what happened after people landed, about the artificial way colonial mapmakers had carved up Africa, about the limits of the genetic reference databases scientists were comparing people against, and above all, about one American state and one cutoff year that together quietly seeded a particular Nigerian people's ancestry into the bloodline of a whole nation. The original study had pointed at the intercolonial trade. Enslaved people shipped first to the Caribbean and then resold into the mainland. Jackson's team said that was real but incomplete, and that the bigger engine for North America had been sitting inside the United States the entire time. To see how, you have to meet the Igbo as they actually were, not as the slave ledgers described them. The Igbo homeland sits in the forested interior, behind the stretch of coast the slavers called the Bight of Biafra, in what is now southeastern Nigeria. And the society there did not look like the kingdoms Europeans were used to dealing with. There was no Igbo emperor, no grand royal court, no single throne to negotiate with. Most Igbo communities governed themselves through councils, assemblies of family heads, gatherings where men representing their kin had a voice, and no one held absolute power simply because of birth or age. They called the core social unit the Umuna. The lineage and authority was diffuse, debated, shared. It was, in its own form, deeply democratic. Women in that world held real power too. Igbo women controlled much of the marketplace, ran their own commerce, and exercised economic independence that had no equivalent in the societies of the men who would soon try to own them. They organized their own assemblies and could collectively discipline a man who wronged them. This was not a simple or a static place. It was a complex civilization organized around autonomy. The idea that a person answered to their kin and their community and bowed automatically to no one. Its trade reached deep into the interior and out to the coast, moving yams, palm oil, cloth, iron, and in its harshest dimension, captives, because Igbo land, like much of the region, had its own internal forms of bondage long before European ships arrived, and the networks that fed the Atlantic trade ran through African hands as well as European ones. The Igbo were not innocent standing outside history. They were a sophisticated, self-governing, fiercely independent people who would prove almost impossible to convert into docile property. Now hold that next to a Virginia tobacco plantation where a human being was reclassified as property, stripped of name and will, and expected to submit absolutely. You can see the collision coming. A people built around the principle that no one is born a master or a slave dropped into a system whose entire logic was that some people simply were property. The Igbo did not adapt quietly to that, and the planners, watching them refuse, did not understand what they were seeing. They reached for the only explanation their worldview allowed. They decided the Igbo were weak. Here's the first thing that needs to be turned right side up because the planters got it exactly backwards. The records of the American South are full of the reputation. The Igbo, written down as Ebo or Igbo, were considered by slaveholders to be melancholy, fragile, dangerously prone to taking their own lives. Some planters paid less for them. They built a whole grim folklore around the Igbo who would sicken and die rather than work. And generations later, that slur got passed down almost as fact, as if an entire people had simply been more breakable than the rest. But look at what was actually happening through Igbo eyes, and the meaning inverts completely. What the planters called a death wish was a refusal, the final, total exercise of autonomy by people who came from a culture that prized it above everything. If your whole society is built on the conviction that no human being is born to be owned, then being owned is not a hardship to be endured. It is an unmaking of the self, and some chose, with terrible clarity, not to be unmade. The most famous instance has a name and a place. In May of 1803, a ship carrying captive Africans, a large number of them Igbo, landed at Savannah, Georgia. The survivors were sold and loaded onto a small vessel bound for St. Simon's Island. Off the coast, the Igbo captives rose up, took control of the ship, and drove their captors into the water. When the vessel ran aground at a place on Dunbar Creek, the group, by most accounts around 75 people, went into the marsh together and into the water, choosing death over enslavement. By tradition, they walked in unison, and the words remembered from that day speak of a water spirit that had carried them and would carry them home. It became known as Igbo Landing. Historians have called it one of the largest acts of its kind in the history of American slavery, and one writer called it the first freedom march in American history. For over a century, skeptics dismissed it as mere legend, until research from the 1980s onward confirmed the documentary basis of the accounts, drawn in part from a letter by the overseer who described the events at the time. The Gula Geechee community on the Georgia coast kept the memory alive for 200 years, passing it down in a one-room schoolhouse and in stories told to children warned away from the haunted creek. And it became the root of one of the most enduring stories in all of Black American folklore, the legend of the Flying Africans, who rose up and flew back across the ocean to freedom. That story has been carried forward by Toni Morrison and by Beyonce. It started with the Igbo. The people the slaveholders called weak gave America one of its most powerful myths of resistance. So how does a people concentrated behind one stretch of African coast end up as the single largest root of a nation's DNA and stay hidden the whole time, unmarked on a single family tree? This is where the mechanism gets quietly astonishing. And to understand it, forget genetics for a moment and think about a river system. Imagine rain falling heavily on one mountain range. The water collects, pours into a single great river, and then, downstream, that river fans out into a delta, dozens of channels carrying the same water across an entire floodplain until it's everywhere, and you'd never guess it all came from one set of peaks. The Igbo presence in America worked like that. The mountain range was the bite of Biafra. The great river was colonial Virginia. And the Delta was the entire American South, every cotton and cane state where Black families would later put down their deepest roots. Here's the concrete history. Of all the enslaved Africans brought into the Chesapeake Bay region, Virginia and Maryland, an enormous share, by some estimates around 38%, came from the bite of Biafra, and the great majority of those were Igbo. So many arrived that some historians have flatly called colonial Virginia Igbo land. The historian David Eltis has estimated that somewhere between 30 and 45% of the Africans imported into Virginia came from that one region, and perhaps 80% of those were Igbo. By one careful estimate, at least 25,000 Igbo were brought into Virginia in the 8 decades before the Revolution alone. The tidewater in the Piedmont interior filled with them. Virginia became a reservoir of Igbo ancestry unlike anywhere else in North America, a place where, generation after generation, that ancestry circulated, concentrated, and put down roots. Then came the year that turned the river into a delta. In 1808, the United States banned the importation of enslaved people from abroad. The transatlantic supply was cut off, but the demand for enslaved labor in the expanding Cotton South was exploding, so the trade turned inward. Over the following decades, the domestic slave trade ripped roughly 1 million people from the Upper South, Virginia chief among them, and marched and shipped them south and west into the cotton and sugar frontier of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. It was a forced migration on a scale that rivaled the Middle Passage itself, and it tore apart families with deliberate, business-like cruelty. Virginia, the great Igbo reservoir, became the great Igbo exporter. Its concentrated ancestry was pumped out across the entire Deep South, scattered into the bloodline of a region that had received relatively few Igbo directly off the boats. Geneticists have a way of describing what happens when a founding population's DNA spreads through everyone who comes after. Picture that original Virginia population as a single deck of cards. Every child inherits a hand dealt from their parents' cards and passes a reshuffled hand to their own children. Run that for 200 years across a population being scattered and remixed by the domestic trade, and cards from that original Virginia deck end up in hands all across the country. The pieces of chromosome inherited intact from a shared ancestor, still recognizable in two people who descend from them, are what geneticists call segments that are identical by descent. They are the literal, physical evidence of a common ancestor. And when a relatively concentrated group seeds a much larger population, those shared segments turn up almost everywhere in people who have no idea they're connected and would never guess they share a great-great-grandparent from the Bight of Biafra. That is exactly what Virginia did. The Igbo who landed in the Chesapeake became, through the brutality of the domestic trade, ancestral to a staggering share of all Black Americans. Their inheritance dealt out across the country, hidden in millions of people who simply think of themselves as African American, with no idea a coastline in southeastern Nigeria is written into their cells. And that brings us to the number that makes this whole thing land, along with the darkest part of how it happened. The historian Douglas Chambers, who has spent his career documenting the Igbo presence in Virginia, has estimated that at least 60% of Black Americans have at least one Igbo ancestor. Sit with that. Not a fringe lineage, not a regional curiosity. A majority, a clear majority of African Americans likely carry, somewhere in their family tree, a person taken from that forested interior behind the Bight of Biafra, and almost none of them grew up knowing it, because the trade that spread that ancestry was also the trade that shattered the memory of it. The domestic slave trade didn't just move bodies. It severed people from their names, their kin, their languages, and any thread that might have led back to a specific African origin. A family sold from Virginia to a Mississippi cotton plantation in 1830 might carry deep Igbo ancestry and have no possible way of ever knowing it, because everything that could have told them had been deliberately stripped away. The legacy is hidden not by accident, but by design. The design of a system that profited from erasing where people came from. We have to be honest about the engine here, because it is harrowing. After 1808, with no new captives arriving by sea, the enslaved population already in the country became, in the cold logic of the slaveholders, the only source of new enslaved labor. That logic produced one of slavery's most monstrous features: the deliberate treatment of human reproduction as a means of production, the forced pairing and sexual coercion of enslaved people to increase the number of human beings that could be sold. Virginia, with its large enslaved population, sat at the center of this internal trade, exporting people south by the tens of thousands every decade. The same machinery that scattered Igbo ancestry across the South was a machinery of forced reproduction and family destruction. The breadth of the Igbo genetic legacy and the depth of the cruelty that spread it are the same facts seen from two sides. None of this responsibility sits with the people who were trafficked. It sits squarely with the system, the traders, and the society that built its wealth on it. Before the last turn, a quick word from me. This channel exists to give you the documented version of these stories, sourced, checkable, neither sanded down nor exaggerated. If that's what you're here for, subscribe, because there is a great deal more of this history that was never put in your textbooks, and it belongs to you. Now let's be just as careful about what the DNA cannot tell us, because the honest version has real limits, and pretending otherwise would betray the whole point. First, the genetics are blurrier than a clean headline suggests. A persistent problem in this field is that the reference databases scientists compare DNA against have long overrepresented certain groups. The Yoruba of Nigeria, in particular, were among the earliest and most heavily sampled West African populations, partly because they were included in foundational genetics projects decades ago. That imbalance can inflate how much ancestry gets labeled Nigerian and can blur the line between Igbo, Yoruba, and the many neighboring peoples of the region. When a test says Nigerian, it is naming a broad and imperfectly mapped region drawn by colonial borders, not handing you a verified ethnic identity. The Igbo signal in African American DNA is real and large, but the precise boundaries are softer than the certainty people often want, and good science says so out loud instead of selling a false precision. Second, even our most famous individual Igbo story carries an asterisk. Olaudah Equiano, whose 1789 autobiography described his Igbo childhood in a village he called Eseka, his kidnapping at around age 11, and the suffocating horror of the Middle Passage, became one of the most powerful voices of the British abolition movement. His book ran through 9 editions in his lifetime and helped push Britain to ban the slave trade in 1807, a decade after his death. For 2 centuries, his account stood as the definitive Igbo testimony. The human face the movement put on a crime measured in millions. Then the scholar Vincent Coretta found a baptismal record and a naval muster roll, both listing Equiano's birthplace as South Carolina, not Africa, and argued he may have been American-born, reconstructing a vivid African childhood the movement badly needed and his own readers expected. Other scholars pushed back hard, pointing to linguistic and clan evidence in the text, the meaning of his name, the identification of his home village with a real place in Igbo land that fits a genuine Igbo. Origin too closely to be invention. The debate is unresolved to this day, and in a way, that uncertainty is its own kind of testimony, proof of how completely the trade severed people from the documented record of where they began so thoroughly that we cannot say for certain where its most famous survivor was born. Third, a point I raised earlier deserves repeating here because it is where responsible history gets tested. The trade out of the Bight of Biafra, like the trade everywhere on the African coast, ran partly through African networks and middlemen who captured and sold other Africans into it. Acknowledging that is not the same as spreading the blame evenly. The transatlantic demand, the ships, the chattel system that turned people into permanent heritable property, and the centuries of profit were built and driven by European and American power. The Igbo who arrived in Virginia were victims of that system, not parties to it. That is where the moral weight stays, and it does not shift. What survives all of it is the core finding, and it is solid. The Igbo are not a footnote in African American ancestry. By the best available evidence, they are one of its deepest foundations. So let's bring it home, because under the studies and the shipping records, this was always about a people being misnamed, and a misnaming that gets corrected at last in the blood. For 200 years, the Igbo carried a reputation written by their captors. Weak, melancholy, broken. It was the lie a slaveholder tells himself when the people he has chained refuse, in every way they can, to accept the chain, when their fierce inherited certainty that no one is born to be owned reads to him as a flaw. The DNA does not just correct the head count, It corrects the character. The people who gave America the flying Africans, who walked into the water at Dunbar Creek rather than be unmade, who produced one of the founding voices of abolition, were never the fragile stock the ledgers claimed. They were among the most defiant people the system ever tried and failed to fully break, and their inheritance is everywhere. It is in the majority of Black American family trees, routed silently through Virginia and out across the South by the cruelest trade in the country's history. Linguists trace fragments of it in the living language of the Gullah Coast, in a word like unu, the Igbo way of saying you to more than one person, still spoken on those islands today. It is in a cultural memory of resistance that surfaces every time someone tells the story of ancestors who refuse. It is in the abolitionist tradition that Equiano's narrative helped ignite, and in the flying African's myth that turns a massacre of grief into an image of flight and freedom. If you are African American, the odds are real and strong that this is part of who you are. That behind you, somewhere, stands a person from that green interior who came from a world without kings, who was told to become property, and who answered with the whole force of a culture that did not believe such a thing was possible. You may have grown up with no name for that ancestor, no village, no memory, the trait allowed to survive. The DNA is the thread the system tried to cut, knotted back together. It cannot give you the name, but it can tell you they were there. The slaveholders thought they were describing a weakness. They were describing a people who would not bow, and that people did not vanish into a footnote about a distant coast. They became, quietly and enormously, part of the foundation of Black America itself.